Hello there! This video is going to help you with your applied activity where you're going to be asked to create structured interview questions and then assess the usefulness of those questions for predicting performance in a hypothetical scenario using the proportion of correct decisions technique. So we're going to start off by talking about why interviews are used, why they're important, then getting into kind of the more detailed explanation than what's in your text about structured interviews, what their purpose and benefits are, and then the two major types of questions used in structured interviews. Then we'll tap into criterion validity, which is just one type of validity covered in your textbook, and focus on the different ways to assess it. So the first question that's pretty important to ask is, why do we even use interviews in the first place, right? Well, they're really popular, and that's mainly because they're a personal approach to employee selection. So they're popular and they're personal. And let's see, full screen this. All right. And again, they're more personal than like a written selection test or like a knowledge test or a computerized test or something like that. And the reason that that's important is because that personal interaction really allows you to evaluate social skills that are really hard to evaluate if you don't actually meet and interact with the applicant. And these social skills are not really easily measured with other procedures. So when we talk about social skills, we're looking at like oral communication, or like interpersonal skills, or really just trying to see what they're like and if there's somebody that you would want to work with. Okay, now unfortunately, the most common type of interview is an unstructured interview. And this is a situation where the interviewer is really free to ask anything that they want. There's really no consistency across different applicants, and there's really no structure, again, because it's an unstructured interview. So really these questions and maybe ratings, but there probably aren't even any ratings, are left to the interviewer's discretion. So the questions really do not have to be tied to a job analysis. So not necessarily tied to a job analysis. And you learned about a job analysis in the last chapter, and that's really just the process of gathering information about the tasks involved with the job and then the competencies required to perform that job well. So when I say it's not necessarily tied to a job analysis, it's maybe not necessarily tied to performance. So again, these types of interviews, the interviewer just kind of goes with their intuition, right? They sit down, they just have a chat with the person. Maybe they have a couple of questions that they ask everybody, but they really just kind of go with the flow and just have a discussion. Maybe not measuring their responses or evaluating their responses in any consistent way, and they're just basically relying on intuition. So questions that you may see in an unstructured interview would be like, where do you want to be in 5 years? Or why should I hire you? Or what do you really want to do in life? Or what's your biggest weakness? Those things are very vague and really aren't necessarily tied to specific aspects of performance on the job. But again, they're the most common types of interviews. So a much better strategy for interviewing applicants is to use structured interviews. And that's where you carefully develop questions based on the job analysis. So it's based on the job analysis. And you also have numerically rated questions. And you are asking everyone the same things. So structured interviews are based on the job analysis, numeric ratings, and asking all applicants the same questions, not just having a, casual conversation. Okay? So there's some serious benefits to structured interviews, but before we get to that, we just want to point out that structured interviews do not rely on intuition. Every single question is clearly linked to the job analysis and performance, right? Because that's what we're always trying to predict when we're doing employee selection. How well is this person going to perform? And really, the structured interview tends to ask questions that are focused on past behavior, future behavior, or some knowledge and skills pertaining to the position. So an example, like let's say that we're hiring for a helicopter flight instructor, which my husband used to be. Some questions that you may see on a structured interview are, how many hours of experience do you have flying this specific model of helicopter? And then they would have an evaluation rating system for, how many hours is the, ideal, like maybe 1,000 or more, what's mediocre, and then what's not a good number of hours. Also, you could ask, tell me about a time, so like a behavioral question, tell me about a time when you prevented a student from crashing the helicopter. And then they could have certain aspects of answers that would warrant more points that could be used towards their overall score in the structured interview. Also, like I've kind of already alluded to, you've got to have a standardized numeric rating system to evaluate the answers. So usually there's like rating sheets that are used to evaluate the favorability of the candidate's answers and maybe some behaviors. We'll get into more details about scoring later because you're going to need to develop that for your applied activity. So the major purpose of structured interviews is because we're asking everybody the same information, we're tying it to performance, you really are giving candidates an equal opportunity to provide information. So unstructured interviews are really problematic because you aren't using a standardized protocol for hiring your employees. So maybe if you're relying on intuition, you may be having a particularly good day and you come in and you just have a fun conversation and you walk away like, wow, that person's really cool. I want to give them a job. But that may not be a good reflection of the candidate's actual potential to be a good employee. It may just be based on the kind of conversation that you had that day. If you use a structured interview, you ensure that every single applicant is going through the exact same process so that you can compare them accurately and consistently. So you can assess them accurately, right, based on performance, and most importantly, consistently. So I know here at Nevada State, when we go through the process of hiring professors, and I've chaired those committees before, we work with HR and they really want to make sure that every single person that comes to Nevada State College to interview gets the exact same experience. We even go so far as trying to make their schedule for the day the same. Like everybody interviews in the morning, does their teaching demonstration after lunch, meets with the deans at the same time, is asked the same questions in the interview, is given the same instructions for their teaching demonstration. That way you are actually comparing them accurately and consistently. So the research is really consistent in showing that structured interviews are far superior at predicting performance. And that makes sense, right? Superior at predicting performance. You tie the questions to performance. You ask all applicants the same questions. It's standardized. You're rating them numerically so you can compare them easily. And more structure in the interviewing process helps minimize personal bias. So I could do a whole lecture on the biases that happen in interviews, but I'm not going to. But basically just realize that by standardizing that interaction between interviewers and candidates, you're really removing a lot of the personal bias that can happen. So now let's dig into the two major types of questions that would be asked in a structured interview. So a behavioral question is really past focused, and it is the best type of question for predicting future performance because the best way to figure out what someone's going to do in the future is see what they've done in the past. So you're really asking about past experiences related to predicting future behavior. So we ask about past experiences and really how they demonstrated job-related skills to handle the situation. And so how they demonstrated those job-related, performance-related skills on the job. So, for example, this job involves persuading employees to follow our safety rules. So, tell us about a time in the past when you had to persuade an employee to do something, right? And then you could even have standardized probing questions if they don't give you the information that you need. So, oh, well, can you tell me more about your past relationship with them and how that informed this and things like that? Situational questions are more future or hypothetical focused. So instead of asking, tell me about a time when, right? So tell me about a time when. These situational questions are like, if this happened, what would you do? So it's hypothetical. And the appropriate and inappropriate responses to these situational questions should really be based on critical incidents of employee behavior. And you learned about critical incidents in the last chapter when you actually used the critical incident technique to perform a job analysis. So these questions should be based on critical incidents of actual things that have happened in the job. Now, the problem with this, though, is that it's really easy to paint a very idealistic picture of yourself when you are responding to a question about what you would do in a specific situation when you're at a job interview, right? It's much more difficult to fluff up or, exaggerate when you're actually talking about, oh, I actually did this one time and here's how it played out. It's really easy to be like, well, if this happened, I would do amazing things. Because, again, you're really portraying your idealized self, not maybe the thing you would probably do if it happened. So here's some examples of situational questions. Like, imagine that you told a client you'd be there at 10 a.m. Well, it's now 10:30 and there's no way you'll be finished with your current job until 11:30. You're scheduled to meet another client for lunch at noon, and then you have to be at another job at 1:15. How would you handle this situation, right? So trying to figure out how they would juggle kind of work overload and some conflict among the different things that they needed to do. Again, not saying what happened when this happened to you in the past. It's if this happened, what would you do? So the process for creating structured interviews is not a very easy one, and you're going to do an applied activity that gives you a very light version of this process. But it is time consuming and it does require some trained experts to do a really good job at it. So that's why the unstructured interviews are so popular, because they're pretty easy to do. But in the long run, if you think long term, you want a selection system that predicts performance. And it takes a lot less time to develop a legit structured interview protocol to use on all applicants than it takes to deal with turnover and retraining and all the issues that happen when you have a crappy selection system. So just keep that in mind. All right, so again, unstructured interviews are more common than structured interviews because interviewers really tend to overestimate their intuition and they underestimate how much bias that they have. And also, again, because those structured interviews just require a lot of time and resources and skills to develop. So the first step is to conduct a very thorough job analysis, which we covered in the last chapter. And that's to make sure that questions are designed to find out if applicants' skills and experiences match those needed to successfully perform the job. So we're trying to figure out tasks needed, the skills, knowledge, skills, abilities, other characteristics, and experience required to do the job well. And that, again, helps you identify the job's main tasks. And really, when you're thinking about main tasks, because there's a lot of tasks involved, right? But you may not want to interview to figure out how well employees are going to be doing at all tasks. You really should just focus on the most frequent and the most important job tasks. So you can usually have a group of subject matter experts evaluate critical incidents or just the job description for that job and figure out, okay, which tasks are going to be the main focus of the interview questions. Then you can construct those questions based on those most frequent or important job tasks and competencies that you identified in step 2. And really, situational and behavioral focused questions are going to have the highest level of criterion validity. So really strive for behavioral questions or situational focused questions, but behavioral is the best. Then number 4, this takes the most time, is determining benchmark answers and rating anchors for each question. So benchmark answers should be written by subject matter experts, which just means people who currently have the job or maybe supervisors of that position. And these subject matter experts really know what successful and unsuccessful performance looks like. So it really helps to talk to subject matter experts. And also, it really helps to base benchmark answers on documented critical incidents of past behavior. So those critical incidents are back again. And it really should be part of any good HR strategy to continuously document critical incidents of times where employees did something really well that made a big difference or did something really poorly that made a big difference in the wrong way. Also, when it comes to the benchmark answers and rating anchors, you have to use a standardized rating scale. Standardized just means consistently applied, where everybody is rated with the same scale. And really, you have these anchors like satisfactory, unsatisfactory, excellent, and that enables the interviewers to keep score on all of the applicants' responses. And there's really 3 main approaches to doing these standardized rating scales. So the most clear cut and easy is the correct and the incorrect approach. So this is basically when some interview questions lend themselves to either have a correct or an incorrect answer, right? They can just simply be scored based on the answer being correct or incorrect. And these are usually used for like job knowledge questions. So do you know the answer to this question? Or disqualifiers. Like, are you willing to work on weekends? Are you certified to handle food? Those sorts of things, which aren't commonly asked in interviews. There's also the typical answer approach. So the typical answer approach is when interview answers are compared to a list of all possible answers to each question. And there's a panel of subject matter experts that rate the favorability of each possible answer. And then these ratings inform the rating scale. Now, it's really difficult to anticipate every answer, but the list does not have to be exhausted. So really, the typical answer approach, you anticipate possible answers. You assign points based on the quality of their answers. But it does not have to be exhaustive because there's no way to anticipate every answer somebody could give you. So exhaustive or all-inclusive. Just to give, basically the goal is that usually you have multiple interviewers, and the goal is that while those multiple interviewers are in the room doing an interview, they're all thinking about the same thing while they're rating applicants, right? They all have the same criteria for excellent answers in mind, and then they can come together and have a conversation later to compare their answers. My favorite standardized rating scale is the key issues approach because it is so difficult to anticipate every answer or even most answers that you could possibly get. The key issues approach is better because, again, it's nearly impossible to anticipate all those responses. So, as an alternative, you can use key issues where you have subject matter experts to develop a list of issues they think should be included in a perfect answer. So basically like the themes or the topics or the issues that should be, not Brie, should be present in answers. And sometimes you can use a combination of both, where you have key issues and then you also have example answers of how those key issues could play out in the answers. And that's actually what I'm going to have you do in the applied activity. So basically, the key issues, you're developing everything that should be included in the perfect answer, but also maybe some things that would be included in not so perfect answers. And then for each key issue addressed, you can give the interviewer a point, or you can have certain key issues grouped together in a rating scale. And you'll see that in a little bit. Then finally, you need to choose 2 or more members for the interview panel. Again, in an effort to remove individual biases, you need to have more than one person doing the interviews. And it's really best to have a mix of interviewers from multiple levels of the organization, including maybe a supervisor, a coworker, and maybe even a member from HR to really make sure that you're avoiding that bias. So here's an example of behavioral interview question and rating scale that I pulled from, and I'll actually provide this for you. I found the Practical Guide to Structured Interviews from the United States Office of Personnel Management. So I'll give you the full guide if you're like really geeking out on structured interviews and you want more information. But this is from that. And so you see here, we've got the competency that we're looking at, interpersonal skills. Then that is defined, which is similar to what you'd see in ONET, right? When you're looking at different knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. Then we have the actual interview question right here. So describe a situation in which you had to deal with individuals who were difficult, hostile, or distressed. Who was involved? What specific actions did you take? And what was the result? So you see that there's a lot of layers to that question, and it's really designed to get the details of what happened from the applicant, right? The who, what, when, and where, and why. And you'll see here we have 5 different levels, and if we start at the best, right, an expert, so they should have competency in exceptionally difficult situations and maybe serving as a key resource. So the answers that have those themes in it are going to be the most high quality answers. So then here's some examples, right? So maybe present shortcomings of a newly installed HR automation system in a tactful manner, explains benefits of controversial policy changes, diffuses an emotionally charged meeting with external stakeholders by expressing empathy. So again, there's no way to figure out all the possible answers you could get to that question. But by giving this to interviewers, they can kind of have an idea of what's expected and then examples of what that could look like. Then you look down here at like level 1. So applies the competency in simplest situation, requires close and extensive guidance. So clearly for this one, they're wanting people to be a resource, not someone who needs resources, right? And then here, they're referring to other employees, right? They need guidance. They organize information for interviews on controversial issues, works with others to obtain employee concerns about controversial policy changes. So you can kind of see how this plays out in the way it's structured. And let's say that they're interviewing people and they give kind of an answer in this area. Well, then they could get assigned a score of 5 for that interview question. And that's how the numeric rating system works. I love examples. It helps really just drive the point home to see it play out. All right, so now let's move on from talking about structured interviews and the types of questions you can develop to validity. And validity is really just figuring out, does this selection test measure what it's supposed to measure? So that's one type of validity. So am I actually measuring cognitive ability with this test? Am I actually measuring social skills with this interview? And validity can also be pertaining to, is this test a valid predictor of performance? And that is criterion validity. So there's many different types of validity. There's construct validity, criterion validity, external validity, all those things. But I'm just going to focus on criterion validity because that is what you're going to be asked to evaluate in the applied activity. So prior to implementing a selection test for prospective employees, it's really important to make sure that the test has that criterion validity, or in other words, it's related to performance. Because if scores on the selection test are consistently related to some measure of performance, then you're going to get bigger bang for your buck, right? So you want to make sure that your interview works, basically, right? it's a predictor of how well employees are going to perform. Now, there's two different types of ways to evaluate criterion validity. The first one is predictive validity, and that's when the test is administered, or the interview or whatever you're testing out is administered to a group of job applicants who are going to be hired. So you are examining it among applicants. So what you do is you give them the selection test or the interview, and then you can see if the test scores are correlated with a future measure of performance. So are selection test scores correlated or related to future performance? Because you're using applicants, right? So you don't know what their performance on the job looks like. So what you do is you introduce this selection test that you're trying out into the selection procedures that you use with all the applicants. But then you do not use that selection test to hire the people in that pool while you're still testing it. So selection test scores related to future performance. Okay, and do not use the test to hire applicants. Just have them complete it. So you can see if it's related to future performance down the road. Ideally, but probably not going to happen, but ideally, every applicant or a random sample of applicants is hired, and then the test scores are hidden from the people who will later make performance evaluations, because you really want to reduce the impact of expectations and biases of evaluators on those performance ratings. So people come in, right? All the applicants come in. They take this extra selection test that you're testing the criterion validity of, but it's not taken into consideration when they do the hiring. And then you collect data on their performance maybe 6 months down the road and see how that compares to the how well they did on the selection test when they were in the hiring process. Now, there is a bit of a problem with predictive validity in that it takes time, right? So it takes time, because you have to wait for that measure of future performance to come in, right? So you're waiting for that future performance, right? Also, there's a little bit of an issue with restriction of range. So what that basically means is that you will not have the full range of scores available to you, because it's really difficult to see how well your selection tool predicts poor performance, because those poor performers are not typically hired, assuming your current selection system works well at predicting performance. So with restriction of range, difficult to see how well your test predicts low performance because they were probably never hired to begin with. So you're not going to have their measure of future performance. And again, that's assuming your current selection system works well and you're identifying good performers to hire. So if every applicant is hired, then you would have a wide range of both test scores and employee performance. And with the wider range of scores, the more accurate your estimate of criterion validity is, because you're able to examine the relationship between the selection tool and performance for performers at all levels, not just the supposed good performers who are hired. Now let's move on to concurrent validity. And this is when the selection test is examined or tested in a group of employees who are already on the job. So concurrent is current employees, not applicants or future employees. So the scores on the selection test are correlated with, or see if they're related to, a measure of the employee's current performance. Okay, so current employees, and you want to see if the selection test is related to current levels of performance. And we hope that if the test scores accurately reflect performance, then there's going to be a significant relationship there, right? Now, concurrent validity is more common than predictive validity, and that's because you get quicker results mainly. You don't have to wait 6 months down the road to get their measure of performance to see if that selection test predicted it, right? You've got probably measures of their performance already ready to be compared to the selection test. So you go among your current employees. Ideally, you take a random sample of those employees. You say, hey, participate in this interview process, or hey, take this test. And then you see how those scores compare to how they're already doing on the job. Now, this strategy results in extreme restriction of range. So think about it. Chances are you're really not going to have information about poor performance, right? You're not going to be able to examine how well your selection test predicts poor performance, because those poor performers are probably not there anymore. They either quit or they've fired. So you're not going to be able to examine how well the test predicts poor performance. Because that's important too, right? You don't just want to be able to predict high performance, but you want to make sure you don't hire those people who are going to be terrible. Because those bad employees either quit or got fired. Also, the problem with this strategy is that you are not really using a representative sample of applicants. Current employees may not be representative of new applicants because current employees already have had on-the-job training, right? So current employees are not equal to applicants, right? Not super representative. Because really the goal is to find applicants and predict their performance, right? So you want whoever you test the selection test with to represent applicants. And current employees just don't, because they've got more knowledge and experience in on-the-job training than applicants do. Now, some selection tests that have the highest levels of criterion validity are cognitive ability tests, job knowledge tests, biodata, and skills-based selection tests. But we are really focused on this activity on structured interviews, which also have high levels of criterion validity if they're used properly. Now I want to show you a very specific way to assess criterion validity. And there's tons of different ways to do it. There's like correlation analyses, t-tests, chi-square tests for independence, but I'm going to focus on this proportion of correct decisions because I think it's pretty straightforward. It allows you to kind of see the process, and it's commonly used. So for this, we have our steps here for step 1 and 2. So the first thing you do is you want to record each employee's score on the new selection test. So let's say that we're testing a cognitive ability test, right? And a numeric measure of their performance. So we could look at their performance appraisal scores. And you'll see that each row represents one employee. So this is one employee. They scored a 2 on the cognitive ability test, and their performance appraisal score was a 4. And just for the sake of making an example, let's say that we're using a concurrent design where we took current employees, 20 of them I believe, and we gave them a cognitive ability test and then compared it to their last quarter's performance appraisal score. So you'll see again, each row represents one employee, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 employees. Now we look over at the scatter diagram. So you'll see that the test goes here, okay? And then the performance goes here. And you see we have the full range of scores represented along each axis. So each one of these dots represents one of these employees, right? So this 1 and 4 dot right here represents this person, right? And this 9, 9 represents, where are you, 9, 9? This person. Just want to make sure you see how that scatter diagram comes to be. Then you need to set cutoffs for passing selection test scores and what is successful performance on the job. So that would be this right here. So for example, you could say that I plan on hiring people, or at least considering people for hire, who get a cognitive ability test score of 5 or higher. And our current criteria for being a successful employee is having a 6.5 or higher on the performance appraisal. Then you divide the scatter diagram into those 4 quadrants based on those cutoff scores. So if we're thinking about cognitive ability tests, right, our cutoff is 5 or higher. So we would go ahead and put a line right there, separating those who got a 5 or higher from those who got lower than a 5. Then for the performance appraisal, right, 6.5 or higher. So that would be like right here. So we're cutting through that. And then you want to label your quadrants 1 through 4 clockwise, starting at the top left. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So now we need to figure out the number of correct decisions made with our selection test. So correct decisions with our selection test. So the way that you do that is you take the proportion of, see, I'll show you. I'll use red now. So we're really going to figure out quadrants 2 and 4. So 2 and 4. Those in quadrant 2 scored high on the test and had good performance. So these would be successful hires with your new selection system, right? The people in quadrant 4 would be successful rejects. So if you were using this cognitive ability test, they would not have scored a 5 or higher, and they don't have acceptable performance. So in that case, you correctly identified employees who shouldn't be hired and successfully rejected them. So what we do is we count in quadrants 2, so quadrant 2 plus quadrant 4, divided by the total sample size, which the abbreviation for that would be a lowercase n, if you want to be fancy. So quadrant 2 has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Quadrant 4 has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And remember, there's 20 total employees. So this gives you 13 divided by 20, and you have a success rate of 0.65. Now let's then compare that to the correct decisions with the current selection method. Okay. So now we're really just going to look at the people who are successful employees or the people who have a high performance appraisal. So we're going to be looking at these people, right, who are in the happy zone for performance. And then also these people. And these are both quadrants of successful employees. Okay, so we have, it's kind of hard to see now. Let me see if I can maybe do a little creative erasing there. All right, now we got rid of our 4 though. Here we go. Okay, so we have 1, 2 in quadrant 1. So we're going to take quadrant 1 plus quadrant 2 over the total number of employees, we've got 2 in quadrant 1 plus those 5 in quadrant 2 divided by the total number of employees. We get 7 over 20 and a success rate with the current selection system of 0.35. That's abysmal. That's not good. So now we are on step 7, right? We've got our baseline. Let me write that into this, our baseline. How well are we doing with our current selection system versus how well would we have done if we used this new selection test, or in this case, the cognitive ability test? Well, we can clearly see that this 0.65 is better. Now, you have to be careful when it comes to deciding should I or should I not start using the selection test. If you have just a slight improvement in correct decisions with the selection test, it may not be worth using unless it's very cheap and quick to administer. If you have a selection test that's going to be more laborious to create, or that takes more time, or that costs more money, then you need to look for a bigger gap to justify. And I would say going between a 65% success rate and a 35% success rate, I don't care how much that selection test costs, you better start using it, because it costs a heck of a lot more, again, to train new employees and recruit and select new employees when those bad ones fall to the wayside. So the key takeaways, right? Structured interviews are awesome. They're better than unstructured interviews. They're tied to performance. They allow you to directly compare candidates because you're asking them the same questions. You're rating them numerically. So at the end of the interview process, it's really easy to rank them based on how high of a score they achieved. It also helps reduce bias because you're not relying on intuition and you have a standardized system that everybody is using for everybody that they're evaluating. Also, criterion validity is just the type of validity that sees if your measure of your selection test predicts performance. Concurrent, use current employees, look at their current performance. Predictive, use applicants and compare their scores on the selection test to future performance. And then I just showed you the proportion of correct decisions where you figure out if I would have used the selection test, would I have been better at predicting high and low performers than the current system that we have today. So I hope you enjoyed learning more about structured interviews and criterion validity, and that this lecture was really helpful for you as you go forward and complete your applied activity.